Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Again, welcome to this week's office hours for ESG and ESG-CV. My name is LaQuantia Goodman, and I am today's moderator. If you are just joining us, please go to the chat and introduce yourself with your name and the region you represent. As a reminder, this office hour session is being recorded for public record. Office hours recordings are on the HCD ESG webpage under Technical Assistance and Training. A copy of the slide deck and recording will also be emailed to you. Next slide. How to ask a question. All questions must be submitted in the chat box. Please type your organization and question into the chat box. The team will read questions out loud at the end of the presentation and will provide answers, if possible, throughout the presentation. All questions and answers entered into the chat box will be recorded as part of the public record. Alongside our presenters, we also have several HCD staff, including ESG representatives, ESG-CV grant administrators, and other consultants who are able to answer questions during the question and answer session. Next slide. Today's office hour session agenda includes the following: ESG and ESG-CV updates, office hours updates, upcoming trainings, ESG and ESG question and answer, and our Spotlight Series presentation, written standards and policies and procedures. Next slide. I'll now turn it over to Sarah for our ESG updates.
Sorry, I'm having technical difficulties this morning.
It's okay.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, LaQuantia. A couple of updates. This is the same stuff we went over last week, but we're going to keep kind of hitting home until everybody is set up. HMIS, please remember you have to enter your contract number into HMIS. This has to be completed no later than the end of this month, so the 28th. Remember, we have an HMIS setup guide on our webpage. Thank you for dropping that in the chat. Questions, contact me personally, and I will help walk you through the process. 2021 standard agreements. Remember, if you've been awarded homelessness prevention funding and you have not turned in your updated policies and procedures for us to review and approve, we will not reimburse those HP expenses until the process has been completed. If you have questions in regards to your policies and procedures or how to turn those in, just turn them into the esgnova@hcd.ca.gov. And I will make sure, or one of the reps will make sure that it gets to your actual rep for review and approval. Excuse me, I'm sorry. If your contract has been executed, which everybody's, except for I believe one entity has been, and you need help navigating the e-civis system to complete your RFFs or adding people from your agency to manage the award, please reach out to us at the ESG NOFA inbox and we will provide personalized TA to you. Next slide, please. Remember, avoid receiving STD 209s, and which also causes reimbursement delays. All of the contracts are managed in e-civis. Please do not email any of your RFF requests to your representative. Sorry about that. All requests for funds must be submitted through e-civis by clicking on the financial report tab. Every request for funds must also include a completed detailed expense report. If you're unsure as to what a detailed expense report is, because you're a new either employee at your entity or maybe you're a new contractor to HCD, please make sure you reach out to esgnova@hcd.ca.gov so that we can find out who your rep is and provide additional technical assistance in regards to the detailed expense report. Remember, we're conducting mini monitoring for every reimbursement request, so it will include anywhere from 3 to 4 line items chosen by your representative, and will also include complete client files. Reminder, all supporting documentation must be redacted and has to be submitted through the secure SharePoint site. Do not put any of your supporting documentation in eCivis, please. If you do not have access to that secure SharePoint site in order to be able to upload documents into those folders, please reach out to us so we can get you set up right away. So be sure to have your supporting documentation ready to submit when requested from your HCD representative. Next slide, please. Another reminder for 2022 applications and awards. I anticipate having those award announcements out and award letters out no later than around the 15th of March. I have everything routing internally for approval. So stay tuned, it's coming soon. Match exemption applications are currently being scored. I believe that they're all going to be scored by the middle of next week. And those are also going to be, the winners will also be announced with the actual 2022 awards. And as a reminder, you cannot add additional people from your organization to view the application or even award once the award letters have been sent out until your contract has been fully executed. Next slide, please. New requirements and the NOFAs. NOFAs are in development. The 2023 NOFAs are in development, with an anticipated release date same as when I actually put the 2022 awards on. So I'm shooting actually for March 16th. We all know how those dates can kind of move just a little bit. Remember, you have to use the HCD approved resolution template without deviations. I cannot stress this enough. If your board will not allow, it has to have a specific resolution, attach it also with that template that is completed. We cannot have any deviations on that resolution template. Remember that for the 2023s, and this will be in the NOFA, that if the template is not used and or deviations are made, you will be disqualified for not meeting threshold. And this is going to apply to all applicants across the board. So whether you're coming in under the continuum of care, non-competitive, or competitive. Policies and procedures for all ESG components. This is effective with your 2022 contracts once those start getting executed. So I would suggest starting to send in your policies and procedures now. You will need to submit your organization's policies and procedures to us for review and approval. That's going to be for every single component. If you have questions, make sure to reach out to us at esgnofa@hcd.ca.gov. I sound like a broken record, I'm sorry. Don't forget, we have all of the policies, the HCD ESG policies and procedures on our homepage under the resources tab. Those are huge, great guides to look at. ICF has been such a huge help and partner with helping develop all of these and provide all this guidance for you all. So please take advantage of that. Next slide, please. Remember, we have our HCD policy documents. These are exactly what I was just going over. On our resources tab, there is a huge, huge list, like so many policies and procedures on here that we cannot even list them on the side. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to read it. Well, at least I wouldn't be able to read them. And there's also a client file checklist. I wanted to note with that client file checklist, even though it says ESG-CV, an annual ESG client can also be used for that client checklist. Just remember that there are specific waivers in regards to CV clients versus the annual ESG. However, 99.9% of all the information that you will need to provide is in that checklist to help guide you for when we are asking for that backup documentation. Next slide, please. All right, so I know I promised this last week, so I'm going to start doing this every week or every other. I don't know if I'm going to bore you guys every single week. I think I will let you guys throw that in the chat as to whether or not you want it every week or every other week. We're going to start doing eCivis Small Bits Spotlight Series, where I show you how to do specific things within eCivis, because I know, and I'm sorry, I promised you all additional TA at the beginning of this year. It has been a little bit of craziness already, I think, for all of us, and everybody's super busy. So that's where this is kind of coming in. So did you know that you can manage your team in eCivis? I get a lot of these questions. So note that the instructions that I'm going to provide will only work if your contract has been fully executed and you are logged into the original account that submitted the application for the award. That is the account owner. That's why we stressed every NOFA so far for the last 2 years with working with eCivis is that when you are submitting those applications, it's extremely important to try and choose a generalized email account to set up these applications, so that if that person that has set up that application is no longer with your agency, it will not take you months to be able to get access to the account. It is a long drawn out process. We have to submit tickets via eCivis to help you all get those accounts transferred over, because it's not something that I can do internally. Otherwise, believe me, I would do it. So let's get going. So the first thing, obviously, you're going to do is to log into your account, and you're going to click on My Awards, which is that middle tab to the left side of the screen, and it's got the red circle around it and the green arrow pointing to it. Next slide, please. Then you're going to click on the 3 stacked lines in the actions column. The actions column is all the way to the right. It's got the red circle with the green arrow pointing to it. And you want to click the green stack. I call it a pancake stack, probably because I love pancakes. And you want to click the 3-line stack for the award that you want to actually open. I know some people may have multiple awards, so that's why I say you have to do this for each one of your awards. It will not automatically transfer over into the next award. Then you're going to click on Manage Award. So once you've clicked that 3-line stack, the little drop down the little pop-up will open up that says Manage Award. Click on that. Next slide, please. Then your award dashboard will open up. I wanted to kind of go over this dashboard here really quickly, just so that you know what this means. The 3 blue tabs on the very left-hand side, that's if you want to view any of your award files, your budget, or your goals. So if you needed access, I had received a bunch of emails asking for the executed copy of the 213, which is your standard agreement. You would go into view files and your executed agreement will be in there. All of your award documents are in there. The 3 green tabs are in regards to submitting things to HCD. So such as financial reports, activity reports if those are required, and grant amendments, which could also mean a budget revision. We will go into those in a later e-Civis small bits, but just so that you know what it is. The yellow button is award closeout. So once you have spent all of your funds or all of the funds that you can spend, and whether you're disencumbering or not, you would click on that yellowish orange tab, submit your final financial report, and then that allows us to start the closeout process. Once again, we'll get into that into another e-Civis small bits as well. So what you're going to do for here is click on the Manage Project Team, which is the blue tab all the way to the right. Another screen will open up, and you're going to scroll down just a little bit, and then it's going to show your project team. Click on the Add Team Member button, which is green. Next slide, please. And then a dialog box will open up. You're going to type in the team member's email address that you want to add to have access to this award. Note, you can only type in one email address at a time. The system will not allow you to type in multiple, so you will end up having to go back and redo some of these steps to add additional people. Next slide, please. If you want that specific team member to also receive notifications for that award, check the receive notifications for this award box, which is circled with the little red circle and has the green arrow pointed towards it. Don't worry, if you forget this step, you can always go back and check that box later. The notifications, just as an FYI, include items such as like mini monitoring tasks that we assign via e-Civis, items related to financial reports. So it would be RFFs that are approved, returned with an STD 209 for corrections, etc. So any of those notifications, you would check that little box. Next slide, please. And then you are going to click the blue Add Member button. Once you have put in the email address and decided whether or not you're going to check that little Receive Notifications box, click that Add Member button. Your invitation to that, God, these screenshots do not look as great as what they did on my computer. Sorry about that, folks. Your invitation will then show up in that project team section right below where you originally clicked the Add Team Members button. And it's going to show the status as pending, which is on the right there. And that's until the team member clicks on the activation link sent to their email address. Next slide, please. Note, if the team member cannot locate the invitational email from e-Civis, please have them double check their junk and or spam inbox. I still have some of the e-Civis notifications that go to the junk mailbox. I'm not sure as to how it decides that it's junk versus real, but just double check that. And once they have accepted the invitation and clicked on the link, note that if it's a brand new member into e-Civis, they don't currently have an account with e-Civis, then they would click on the link. It's going to ask them to create an account. You're going to need to verify your email. And once they have verified the email, then they'd have to go back in and click that activation link again in order to have access to that actual award. We can go into next week into the e-Civis small bits in regards to setting up an actual account if you all would like. Remember, if you want to add more team members, follow the steps 6 through 10 until all people have been added. So make sure to join us at next week's e-Civis Small Bit Spotlight Series on submitting a budget revision. Do you and or your providers need additional help navigating eCivis? Our ESG team can set up personal technical assistance trainings for you and your team. If you would like that, please send us an email at esgnofa@hcd.ca.gov requesting that additional eCivis technical assistance. Please make sure that you include all of the email addresses for the people you would like included in that invite. Next slide, please. And of course, our ESG team representatives. This is where the magic happens. We've got Diana Prado, Giovanni Martinez, Tuesday Cool, and Anthony Zepeda. If you have any questions in regards to your contract, reach out to your ESG representative listed above, or of course, once again, sounding like a broken record, you can contact us at esgnofa@hcd.ca.gov. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn it back over to LaQuantia. One last thing, if everybody can throw in the chat what they would prefer, if they would prefer these eCivis small bits weekly or bi-weekly, I would appreciate it. Then at least I know I'm not taking up too much of your guys' time every single week if you want it bi-weekly. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Sarah. Before we move on, we have a question from Ben at Santa Clara. Can applicants route 2 resolutions to our boards, one for the HCD required template and one that conforms to their local standards and requirements?
Absolutely. We've had that happen. And I know that that's the biggest thing with our COCs. I know this. We know this, that you all have no control over what your board has to put in there or wants to put in there. I get it. And then of course we're tied because we don't have control over what our legal department has to have, wants to have. So yes, we have had many entities that turn in both. That is perfectly fine.
Great. Thank you, Sarah.
Of course.
Now for our ESG-CV updates. Reminders for performance milestones. All program funds for projects, street outreach, emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, homelessness prevention, all must be expended by September 30th, 2023. All funds for HMIS and administrative costs shall be expended by October 31st, 2023. All final RFFs must be submitted to the department no later than November 15th, 2023. Next slide. Our upcoming office hours topics. On February 22nd, we'll have street outreach policy and eligibility documentation. On March 1st, emergency shelter policy and eligibility documentation. March 8th, rapid rehousing requirements, and March 15th, homelessness prevention requirements, the ESG annual. Please use the below links to access the training site and to register for upcoming office hours. Next slide. And on the next 2 slides, you'll see our trainings for February and March. On February 21st, the Effective Non-Congregate Shelter Session 3. On March 7th, Housing Problem Solving, the New and Non-Traditional Provider Series. Next slide. March 16th, the Shared Housing, which is a community workshop series. And to kick off April, on April 4th, there will be Evaluating Client Eligibility, New and Non-Traditional Provider Series. Next slide. Any other questions or anything right now? Next slide. If at whatever time you do have any further questions, please contact your annual ESG representative or reach out to ESG-NOFA@hcd.ca.gov or for ESG-CV, you can reach out to your grant administrator. Next slide. And we'll now turn it over to Gordon and Shavana for our Spotlight series on written standards and policies and procedures.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Gordon Levine. My pronouns are he and him, and I am white and Jewish. I'd like to invite my co-presenter to introduce herself.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Shavana McCaleb, and I go by the pronouns of she and her.
Very good. Thank you, Shavana. Today, we're going to be talking about written standards and policies and procedures. We do have a lot of content to cover and not a lot of time to do it in. So if we're talking a little faster than normal, please do just hop in the chat with any questions you might have. We'll do our level best to cover those. Next slide, please. Okay. Key vocabulary. We're going to be using this the entire presentation, so it's important to kind of zoom in on this to make sure that you've got your arms around it. A subrecipient is a local government entity or nonprofit that receives ESG directly from HCD. So that's anybody who's got a contract with HCD directly to provide ESG services. And we distinguish between direct subrecipients, which are those organizations that get ESG via direct contract with HCD, and sub-subrecipients, which are any other organizations that receive ESG via contract with a direct subrecipient. So to give you an idea, the stream goes HUD to HCD to a direct subrecipient to a sub-subrecipient. A project, by contrast, is an ESG activity within a single program component with a shared set of project policies and procedures, staff, and participants. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but generally speaking, what we're talking about is a rapid rehousing project run by a subrecipient with one policies and procedures. Maybe they've got contractors, maybe they don't, but they've got they serve their 30 participants. That's a project. Next slide, please. So as I said, this is the funding stream we're talking about. HUD's kind of off screen on this slide, but HCD is the recipient. Direct subrecipients get their money from HCD, and sub-subrecipients get their money from direct subrecipients. The key thing to note on this slide is that any subrecipient, regardless of whether they're a direct sub or a sub-sub, can operate a project. Either way, there's no meaningful difference between which is running the project. Next slide, please. So what is a project? A project, as I said, is this shared set of things and people that are occurring. So at a funding level, we've got ESG program funds and match within a project. Within the project itself, you've got all of the organizations that contribute to it, including the primary subrecipient who holds the primary contract, any sub-subrecipients, which could go all the way down, sub-subrecipients, and any contractors. So for example, if you're bringing in someone to do outpatient behavioral health services, for example, and you're paying them, they're a contractor to provide services. Please do note again that the primary subrecipient can be a direct subrecipient or a sub-subrecipient. Doesn't make any difference at all. And then within the project itself, you've got all of the sort of connective tissue of the project, the things that make it. Its policies and procedures, its practices, which is what it actually does on the day-to-day, the direct services it provides, the services it provides by referral or by contract, its staff and its participants, the thing that make a project look like itself. Next slide, please. So, subrecipients versus project. They are not the same thing. Subrecipients are legal entities. They're organizations that receive funding by contract, either from HCD or from another direct subrecipient. Their scope usually includes multiple projects, some of which are ESG funded, some of which are not ESG funded. Very large subrecipients have hundreds of things that could be considered projects. Smaller subrecipients may have only a few. Subrecipients are governed by a board or a similar organization or entity that provides oversight and managed by its executive officers, such as a president or a CEO or a chief operating officer, and so on. Projects, by contrast, exist only in concept. There's no unlike the COC program, which you may also be familiar with, ESG doesn't have projects as this concept of a thing that exists. They're again, they're conceptual, and they are created by that interplay of their policies, their practices, the people who work for them, and the people who they serve. Projects are operated by subrecipients. There's something that a subrecipient does. They have a narrow and specific scope. A project does one thing. It is a rapid rehousing project, or it's a shelter project that serves this participant subpopulation. It takes this action. It's governed by contracts and by its policies. You should be able to pick up the project contract and its policies and procedures and understand how the project works just by reading through those. And if not, then there's a problem with documentation. Finally, projects are managed by program manager staff, so folks usually who are not also executive officers. It's unusual. It is possible for very small subrecipients particularly to have somebody wearing multiple hats, like their executive director is also their program manager, is also doing like case management. It's unusual. And generally speaking, there's a difference between executive officers and program management staff. Next slide, please. I'm going to kick it over to Shivana.
Thank you, Gordon. Differentiated responsibilities. Why are these distinctions important? Again, direct subrecipients must have written standards and projects must have policy and procedures. Next slide, please. The direct subrecipient project. Again, HCD awards ESG to direct subrecipients. The direct subrecipient receives ESG direct from HCD. It's important to note that the direct subrecipient does not subaward ESG to another organization. And then the project operated by the direct subrecipient may or may not have contractors. Next slide, please. Now, your subrecipient project. Again, HCD awards ESG to direct subrecipients. Your direct subrecipients receives it from HCD, and it serves, your direct subrecipient serves as a pass-through or an administrative entity. And then your subrecipient receives it direct from the direct subrecipient. It operates the projects. And then the project operated by the subrecipient, again, may or may not have contractors. Next slide, please. The differentiated responsibilities. The direct subrecipient projects develop project and policy and procedures. And then your subrecipient projects, subrecipient develops projects, policies, and procedures. And then all projects, direct subrecipient develops written standards. Next slide, please. Written standards. We're going to go into a little bit more detail about the written standards. Next slide, please. Okay, written standards are created by the direct subrecipient, applied to all projects operated by the direct subrecipient and their subrecipients. Written standards can either be narrow or broad. What they don't define must be defined by the project policy and procedures. And written standards cannot, the direct subrecipients' written standards cannot contradict and upstream rules like HCD written standards or the ESG interim rule. Next slide, please. The reason why for written standards is to ensure all projects operated by a direct subrecipient and their subrecipients are, one, compliant with all applicable rules and requirements from HUD and HCD. They must be aligned with local needs that are shared by all affected projects. And they should be designed with best practices to maximize the number of people served and the quality of services delivered. Next slide. Okay, an overview of written standards. Each project type, for example, rapid rehousing, emergency shelter, has its own written standards requirements. Written standards requirements are defined in each project type's HCD manual. 80% of written standard requirements are the same for all projects, regardless of the type. An example of this would be is that all of the projects must have eligibility requirements. Most requirements are what you'd expect. For example, rapid rehousing must have a process for assessing fair market rent and rent reasonableness. Next slide, please. Okay, but some are more nuanced. For example, most project types have some housing problem solving implementation requirements. All CA-HCD project manuals have a provision that empowers HCD to refuse to issue reimbursements until the direct subrecipient has HCD approved written standards. And defining all written standards requirements are out of the scope for today's presentation. Instead, we are going to focus on rapid rehousing as an example. Next slide, please. And so rapid rehousing written standards. Coordinated entry must detail how projects will comply with the local COC's coordinated entry process. Participant eligibility must detail requirements for how projects establish and document participant eligibility, and also must detail a process for conducting a needs assessment, which may be used to help determine participant eligibility, inform participant services, or both. And then suite of services must define all services that projects can offer, which are limited to eligibility activities listed in the CA-HCD ESG Rapid Rehousing Manual. Also must detail requirements for how projects assess each program participant's barriers to housing and self-sufficient, and how projects then design individualized, strengths-based plans to ensure each participant receives only services intended to address those barriers. And it must detail how often program participants are required to reassess and adjust participant service plans. Next slide, please. The staffing pattern must describe estimated caseloads for rapid rehousing projects, which must be sufficient to meet any commitments or projections regarding the number of participants the direct subrecipient will serve, and must define a process for entering into HMIS, which may be handled at the direct subrecipient level, the project level, or a mix. Termination and appeals must detail requirements for participant termination and appeals. We all know that, the last resort is to terminate a participant, but if you must have those, you must submit to them in writing, and you must have the appeals process on that form. General operations must provide sufficient information about the operations of all projects operated by the direct subrecipient and its subrecipients that a person unfamiliar with those projects could reasonably understand and reconstruct them. Again, as Gordon mentioned earlier, those general operations and in your written standards must be able to be understood by the program participant or anyone else. Next slide, please. What about project policy and procedures? Well, I'm glad you asked. If written standards define all these things, why do we need project policy and procedures? Next slide, please. Okay, passing responsibilities down. Whatever the written standards don't define, it is very important that the project policy and procedures are required to define. Next slide. And now I will hand it back over to Gordon.
All right, thank you, Shavana. We're going to talk about project policies and procedures now. Next slide, please. Okay, so unlike written standards, project policies and procedures, these are created by project funding subrecipients. Either the direct or the subs, doesn't matter. It's whoever's the primary subrecipient on the contract. Each project has its own P&Ps that are specific to it. So remember how we talked about projects existing in concept and being held together by the connective tissue of staff, participants, process, practice. This is the sort of beating heart of the project. project policies and procedures complement written standards by filling in those details that the written standards don't get. In concept, written standards sort of define a possibility space for all projects in the area to operate from. Project policies and procedures take that possibility space and they narrow it down from what could be into what actually is. Next slide, please. So why do we have project policies and procedures? Why are we gassing on about this? Why does this even matter? Well, they're important for three reasons. They're actually important for lots of reasons. But the sort of three key things are A, the goal is ensuring that the project complies with all the applicable standards, HUDs, HCDs, and the COC or the ESG direct recipients written standards. B, it ensures that the project is clearly defined. Project operations ought to live in and proceed from the PMPs. Again, if your policies don't reflect what you're actually doing, if there's a significant gap between them, you've got a documentation issue. At the end of the day, you do need to be able to reconstruct a project from its policies and procedures. And there's always an interplay between what you do and what's in the policies. Practice evolves and then goes into policies, which evolves practice, which evolves policies. Finally, C, policies and procedures are designed to incorporate those best practices that are either sort of cutting edge or not widely adopted, such as housing problem solving, progressive engagement, but also trauma-informed care and motivational interviewing. All of those things that we know from a research perspective lead to better outcomes for participants, even if they're not intuitive or the lowest hanging fruit in terms of project implementation. Next slide, please. So an overview. Each project, as we have gassed on about significantly, has its own policies and procedures. Policies and procedures should not look the same from project to project. One of the things that is a giant red flag when reviewing a subrecipient that has multiple ESG funded projects is if they have one policy and procedure manual that has a section for rapid, a section for housing, homelessness prevention, a section for ESG or shelter and so on. If you're treating your rapid and your homelessness prevention project like they're the same, but for slightly different people. That's true from an activity standpoint, but from an approach standpoint, they're very different. Even more true between subrecipients. If you get it into your head that you need policies and procedures, and so you ring up another agency that you're friends with and say, hey, can we borrow yours? It's a good starting point and will help you get an idea of format, for example. But if you adopt another project's policies and procedures without really reflecting your practice in them, you've got a documentation issue. PMP requirements are defined in each project type's HCD manual, or admittedly they will be. Right now, just homelessness prevention hasn't so far, but the rest is coming. As I said, policies and procedures exist in dialogue with written standards. You can't really understand a project without both, because at some level, written standards are always going to be saying, hey, we're passing this down to the projects. And at some level, policies and procedures are going to be saying, like, as specified in the written standards, blah, blah, blah. Generally speaking, PMP is about implementation, where written standards are about requirements. Written standards, again, say what must be. Policies and procedures talk about what is. Next slide, please. This is yet another way of saying these things exist in dialogue with each other. Written standards define and PMPs implement. Next slide, please. So there are two different models, and if you pay attention to anything other than the bright red slides, this is the one you want to pay attention to. There are really kind of two models that exist at different poles of the written standards and policies and procedures implementation. The first model is quote unquote hard written standards. They're assertive, prescriptive, and broad. And so at the HCD level, the requirement is that written standards have to have a process, for example, for ensuring that homelessness prevention projects serve only those who will experience literal homelessness without HP services, using that as our example. The written standards under the hard model might say that all homelessness prevention projects have to use the ACME homelessness prevention triage tool as the sole determinant of whether a person will experience literal homelessness without HP services. As a result of which, policies and procedures must say case managers administer the ACME HP triage tool as step something of the project's intake process. But the part of this that is prescriptive, the hard model, is the written standards say you have to do it this way. And so the policies and procedures will always say, okay, we're doing it that way, and here's how we're doing it. Next slide, please. On the other end of the spectrum, we have soft written standards. So these are less prescriptive, they're descriptive, or they pass the requirement down entirely to the policies and procedures. So for example, at the HCD level, again, written standards have to have a process for ensuring that HP projects serve only those who will experience literal homelessness without HP services. Same requirement from HCD. But the soft written standards might just say projects have to define in their P&Ps how they will determine whether somebody will experience literal homelessness without HP. The difference being in this softer model, all they're saying is projects have to define a process for doing this. You can use whatever tool you want. You can use whatever method you want. You don't even need a tool. Just tell us how you're going to do it. You will notice that that is another way of saying functionally, HCD requires us to make sure that this happens. So we're requiring you to make sure that this happens. We're going to do none of it. We wash our hands of this requirement other than monitoring that each project is going to do it. As a result, you get policies that look like this. Project's going to use a combination of a triage tool and qualitative interviews to determine whether a person will experience literal homelessness without HP. And case managers conduct interviews and administer the triage tool at the beginning of the project triage process. You'll notice that the P&Ps under the soft written standards model are broader and more descriptive. They're also more diverse and they're more nuanced. In many cases, hard model written standards make sense for certain requirements. For this requirement, I selected it in part because it is something that's more nuanced. One of the things you have to remember when writing written standards is that if you say homelessness prevention has to do X, that will be true for all homelessness prevention projects funded under the direct recipient, their own and externally. And so unless you're really sure that everybody needs to be doing it exactly the way you say in the written standards, it's a good idea to think about whether you want to say, okay, just define a process and we'll monitor to make sure that it's compliant. Next slide, please. So let's pull it all together. And as you can see, our sample photo for that is cats and dogs living in harmony. Next slide, please. So direct subrecipients are required to have written standards that meet a range of requirements. And those requirements can be met in the written standards and project policies and procedures, or in almost every case, a combination of both. Subrecipients, direct subrecipients have the responsibility for all of it. They can encumber sub-subrecipients with any of it, but the direct subrecipient is on the hook for all of it. In the same way that HCD is on the hook for everything the direct subrecipients do from HUD's perspective. As I said, direct subrecipients really ought to think carefully about what you define in written standards versus what you leave in P&Ps. We really already discussed this, but generally speaking, you want to define the stuff in written standards that's the same for everybody and everybody's cool with it, and leave the nuanced stuff to the policies and procedures. Next slide. As I said, direct subrecipients ultimately responsible for ensuring that all of the written standard requirements are met through a combination of written standards and P&Ps. However, direct subrecipients should, note that there's a should in there. It's not a must, but it's a should. We strongly encourage that. Direct subrecipients should work closely with project operators, internally and externally, to determine where to address each requirement. And there really is no one size fits all. Different direct subrecipients are going to do it differently. And that's okay because they have different projects and different populations, different amounts of money, different geographies. Things are different between direct subrecipients. And so that's a plug both for making sure that your written standards and policies and procedures are nuanced, and for not just borrowing your neighboring COC's policies and thinking it'll be okay if we just borrow it and slap our name on it. Doesn't work that way. Next slide, please. Which brings us to the end. We would love to hear any questions or comments that you have about this, especially questions along the lines of like, do we have to do it this way? Or what's a good way to do this? Or what do you think about this? at the end of the day, all y'all are going to be developing these written standards and these policies and procedures for each of your direct subrecipients and each of your projects. And so that's a big shift. It's new, it's challenging. It will take time. Everybody gets that it will take time. And so this is an opportunity, if you are in the middle of this process, if you're looking at this process, if the stuff that we just talked about scared the daylights out of you, ask your questions. We're here and happy to help. And I see absolutely nothing in the chat box. That's always a little worrying to me, because either Shavana and I did an incredibly good job of explaining things, which I think is probably not true. I never think I did that good of a job. Or it means somebody out there has a question and isn't asking it. So whoever's out there with a question and isn't asking it, I beg you, this is your time. This is your moment.
Gordon, I think you all did do a good job, but I do agree that some participants are probably a little shy and not asking the question that they have.
Shy is okay. Shy is okay.
And that's okay. You can always email it to us and we will be more than happy to respond to your email.
That's true. But this is a judgment-free zone. What is the timeline? So Pamela asks, what is the timeline for this to be done? That is an extremely good question, Pamela. Thank you for asking. We did not touch on that. The timeline for developing compliant written standards is written into each project types manual. So if you want to know what the timeline for HP is, you're going to go to the HP manual. What I'll tell you is that all of them have the same timeline in them. I will save you the step. The way it's structured, there is no, you need to do this by this date for any of the project subtypes. But HCD has the option, further than that, not just there's no timeline, but you can keep on spending money, no problem. But until you have approved written standards at the direct subrecipient level, which again means talking to your subs about their projects and yourself about your projects, until you have approved written standards, HCD may elect not to offer reimbursement for any expenses until those policies are approved. Right now, HCD has taken a blanket approach to homelessness prevention. So for homelessness prevention projects, you do have a timeline. You can spend all the money you want, but until you get your policies or your written standards, until you get your written standards approved, you will not be receiving a reimbursement. I do not believe that HCD has chosen to implement that requirement for any other project type. And I see Sarah off mute. Sarah, do you want to hop in there?
Right. I was just going to say, yes, we have took a hard stance for 2022, all policies and procedures for all components.
Okay, thank you for that correction. So,
of course.
So the timeline then is you're in your own time, but you cannot request reimbursement under a project type until you've got approved written standards for that policy type. And I think Aaron wants to hop in with a comment about monitoring. Aaron?
Yeah, one thing I wanted to mention just while we're talking it, because I feel like the message has kind of been no timelines. I will say that in monitoring, we are looking to see whether communities have written standards, especially in regards to if they've received annual ESG funds previously, then in theory, they should have had written standards in place since they were previous recipients, but we will be marking it in the monitoring report if you don't have them on file, and then you will have a timeline that you have to get those together. So in order to not get stuck in that situation where you're trying to rush through it as a result of monitoring corrective actions, I recommend trying to get started on that now so that you can take your time and think through it if you're not currently under HCD monitoring for ESG-CV.
Absolutely. Thank you, Aaron. I appreciate that. Always important to balance that there is no specific timeline doesn't mean that you don't have to do it, and there isn't time pressure. Absolutely. We had another question in there. Is there a template available to help structure how we draft out the written standards? Sarah, looks like you're nodding. Do you want to hop in there?
Sort of. I mean, and because you helped us, if not more than helped us write it. There are templates, and I'm going to plug the resources tab on our webpage again. Please go to our homepage, click on the resources tab. There are templates to help guide you. It does not give you very specific language. We don't want you to copy and paste our policy into your own policy. It should be based on your area and your client's needs. But there is a template for the manual template for HP at least and RR.
Perfect. I think what I would add to that is, as someone who's monitored kind of a lot of these for different communities, the worst thing in the world is seeing the template with somebody else's name on it and no local details. This is an opportunity for you to reflect what you're actually doing onto the page, not just take the template, put your name on it and call it done. Both because that's a nightmare. And because my guess is HCD will kick it back to you and say you need to do 16 changes. And I might be the one reviewing it, and I don't want to have to review it. So please give us something good to work with. We would appreciate it. We've got a question from Pamela. How or where do we submit the written standards? Sarah, where would you like those to go?
Submit them to the ESG NOFA inbox. And if you could CC me on all of those emails, just so that I have kind of a little tickler that on my calendar to make sure that the rep does follow up with you.
Sounds good. We've got a question from Miriam. How often should written standards be updated? And if we update our P&Ps to reflect new practices, do we need to notify HCD? Written standards should be updated as often as necessary. I think as a good practice, annually reviewing them, even if you make no changes, is a good idea, and documenting that annual review is a good idea. There is no provision that you need to notify if you make changes to your written standards. But I think broadly speaking, if I'm not speaking out of turn, minor changes, probably a good idea to flag during monitoring. Major changes, you probably want to flag to your GA if you're substantially changing things. That said, substantial changes probably aren't possible without a contract amendment if they're as substantial as we're talking about. So I think there's a balance there. Sarah, anything you wanted to add that?
Nope, you hit the nail on the head.
Perfect. So Patricia asks, as the subrecipient, the subrecipient should provide us with a copy of the written standards to direct your PAPs. First of all, yes. But second, it should be more than just providing you a copy. It ought to be a dialogue, right? As a project sponsor, regardless of whether you're the direct recipient or a subrecipient, your project policies and procedures need to be developed with the written standards in mind. And ideally, the written standards are developed with project input in mind so that everything is reflecting the intention of the other. I see another question. Aaron wants to hop in again on monitoring. Go for it, please.
I think I can answer Rock's question. It probably depends which monitoring you're getting. Is it ESG-CV or ESG? If it's ESG-CV, right now you do not have to submit anything else because we're still in the process of monitoring you all. But if it was ESG, I think Sarah might probably the same thing. Send it to the NOFA email address. Okay. One thing I just wanted to point out real quick, because I know we're ending, is we've heard a lot of times people will say, oh, well, our COC written standards are our ESG standards. And just one quick reminder that those are not necessarily one and the same. ESG, requirements do differ a little bit from COC requirements. So just want to make sure that, especially when it comes to monitoring, turning in your COC's written standards does not necessarily mean that requirement's been met.
Cool. I think that's a great point. Yeah, those are detangled. The other thing I would add, in addition to the minimum written standards as required by HUD, note that HCD has expanded the requirements for written standards beyond what is required in the ESG program interim rule. For each project type, you're going to want to go to that HCD project type manual to see what is required. Broadly speaking, it's more specific than the federal requirements, with the addition that you need to have a sort of daily, monthly, annual operations TikTok in there. Looks like we've run out of questions. Any last second questions? Feel free to hop off mute if you want to ask them. See, I told y'all you'd have questions if we just waited a little while. I think we are done. From me and Shavana, thank you very much for your time and attention. I'm going to turn it back over to LaQuantia to have us out.
And thank you all for those questions as well. Remember, as you log out today, that a quick survey will pop up. We ask that you answer it and give us your feedback so that we can continue to provide useful trainings and technical assistance for you. Thank you for joining us today, and we will see you all next week.